So hello and a very warm welcome to our fourth webinar in the Living Room series on understanding the lasting impact of COVID-19, hosted by Belong, the Cohesion and Integration Network. For those of you who haven't tuned in before, Belong is a new national network which connects, supports and mobilises those from different sectors working in the cohesion field. My name is Christine and I'm going to be your host for this webinar. Now I'll welcome Amanda Vernalls, who leads the research, insight and analysis functions at Youth Sport Trust, a children's charity which looks to improve young people's well-being and life chances. And with her today is her colleague, Lisa McHendry, Director of Innovation and Insight and lead on new programme development. So hello, Amanda and Lisa. How are you doing today?
Right, thank you very much. You?
Yes. And how are you, Lisa?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Christine.
Fantastic. So what I'd like you to do, Amanda, is if you could begin by sharing your presentation and then we'll come back to the Q&A afterwards. Excellent. So just put it on slideshow and we'll be good to go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Ready to go? Yep. So thank you, Christine, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. For those that haven't heard much about Youth Sport Trust, as Christine said, I run the research and analysis teams here at Youth Sport Trust, which means we do analysis on programmes. We also act as a consultancy for other organisations as well. And our other role is to inform policy, looking at youth sport and activity across the whole sector. For those that haven't heard of Youth Sport Trust, as Christine said, it's a children's charity. We're celebrating our 25th year this year, probably not as dramatically as we're planning to spend it this year, but celebrating it nonetheless. And we use the power of sport and physical activity and PE to improve children's life chances. That's through improving their well-being, through healthier lifestyles and hopefully greater attainment to make them achieve the best they can be in life. And everything we do is underpinned by research and analysis, and hence why my particular interest in pulling together research around the impact of COVID restrictions on young people, because obviously it's going to be something that is going to be salient to our charity, but obviously many other parts of the world for many years to come. So that was my thinking when I started to pull together this paper, which has got a life of its own now, really. So I've produced an evidence paper which is available on our website and is a lot more detailed than what I'll be able to cover today. And what it is a collation of all of the evidence that I've come across since April, when the lockdown first started. And it looks at a number of different sources. I've pulled together everything I can. It's become a bit like the Fourth Bridge, so it never ends. Every day I'm adding more bits to it. But the sources include government, academic research, interviews, research that's coming out all the time from charities and from NGBs. And I've augmented that with new research that Youth Sport Trust has undertaken amongst children and teachers and parents. And I've tried to collate it in such a way that as I'm pulling together consistent themes as they're emerging. As I said, the paper's changing by the day. I try to put the most recent one out about once a month, and that's on our website. And it does have a lot of references at the back. I've put over 40 sources. I'm probably more like about 60 sources now. But I won't be an expert in any of the particular sources, but hopefully what the paper does is it directs you to what's out there and helps you in your own fields of work. But I encourage you to go and have a look at the full report and sign up to get further updates as they become available. So what we're talking about today is to firstly give a bit of context to what's actually happened to children and what could be impacting them, and then to look at what the overall mental and physical impact has been on children. A little bit about what's helped. I know that was a question that was raised the other week in one of the previous webinars, and I've tried to have a look to see what's out there. A bit about home learning and the impact that's had, and then looking at returning to school, and I've got some new data there to share with you, and then just some thoughts about what this actually means and what we can do going forward. So let's start with some context. If you think about what children have been through in the last few months, I mean, we've all been through quite a bit, but I think I'd argue that the impact on children has probably been particularly severe. The biggest impact obviously has been the closure of schools, because it's not only losing education, but it's also losing the associated services and the associated things that come with a school. So we're not just talking about education, but we're talking about the safeguarding that a school has in place, the mental and the wellbeing support services, free school meals. Obviously, Marcus Rashford's done a great job at pulling some of that back. The special educational needs support. The physical activity and the opportunities for physical activity, so be that direct in terms of timetabled activity, but also indirect, so travel to school, travel around school, play at lunchtime, all of that's gone overnight. And with it, the social interaction, both at play and in the classroom. It's been quite stark to see, you know, when you're sitting in front of a screen, you're not able to talk to your friends, you're not able to interact, how much that impacts on children. And they've missed out on huge milestones and rites of passage and celebrations. If I think about, you know, my son, you know, in the course of a 7-minute presentation by Boris, he didn't finish his A-level, he didn't get to take his exams, he didn't get his end of year prom, you know, just things like that. It's a massive impact on children's lives that happened almost in an instant. On top of that, there was the introduction of home learning, and I'll talk a bit more about that, but that's been patchy, I suppose, in terms of delivery and support and engagement, and also movement being severely restricted and being forced to stay at home, and sometimes in quite difficult living situations. So for some children, you know, where they have a caring responsibility or where they're living with parents that may be abusive or have alcoholism or something like that, to be able to be forced to stay at home and not to have the respite of school has been hard on particular groups of children. And on top of that, I mentioned about the reduced social interaction. There's no face-to-face time with friends at a point when children really want to be with their friends, potentially more than with their family. And also restrictions on physical activity, not just the things at school, but on clubs, on sports facilities, etc. And on top of all that, there's been a risk of catching a deadly disease, which is obviously quite scary. So the impact on children, as I said, has been quite heavy, and we know from the research that's coming through that the impact is then magnified for young people. So what we see is children have less control over their lives. They're less able to do something about it than adults. So 26% of children are saying that they're feeling trapped. They also feel socially distancing, and they feel social distancing more acutely. So for adolescents in particular, there's a need for peer interaction, and they're increasingly sensitive to social stimuli, and that's been taken away from them at a crucial stage in their development. Similarly, they feel stress more acutely, and they're more susceptible to those life disruptions because their brains can't regulate the emotions in the way that adults can. So it's likely that any impacts can have a more long-lasting effect on them than on adults. And another stat was that they're 3 times more likely to develop depression as a result of loneliness. And it's actually the duration of the loneliness which is more important than the intensity of it. And obviously, you know, we're talking about 3 or 4 months worth of loneliness for some children. And add on to that, you haven't got the support services that were in place before. So the impact, unsurprisingly, has been overall, these are some figures from Bernardo's release recently, children at the moment are lonelier and sadder, more worried and more stressful than usual. And as Leah Levata talked about a couple of weeks ago, there's some children who are particularly struggling with anxiety and with trauma-related symptoms. And the impact seems particularly disproportionately affecting some children. So to pull out some particular examples here, those with pre-existing medical health conditions who've had support in the past and have now had that taken away from them or curtailed. Similarly, we see research from Kooth, which shows that children from a Black and Asian minority ethnic background have been struggling much more intensely, and some of that may be down to the fact that, you know, their parents and themselves are more likely to be affected by COVID itself. and have probably seen those stats out there, and they're reporting back high levels of anxiety, and that's coming through on the helplines that COOth are operating. Similarly, those with special educational needs, those in support of pupil premium and the children of key workers are coming through as particularly people who seem to be more vulnerable and more affected by the impacts. On top of that, we see that there's fewer referrals being made to children and mental health services, children and adolescent mental health services in some areas, and you've got the schools less likely to be able to pick up on those issues at the moment. And there's also practical issues about the provision of mental health services. So practitioners have been talking about, certainly early days, not having physical infrastructure in place and not having some of the softer things in place, like knowing how to get around GDPR and safeguarding to be able to help and support children. And children themselves have struggled to access online facilities, and they struggle to find the privacy that they require to actually have that one-on-one interaction. So, as Leah mentioned a couple of weeks ago in a great talk on the effects of COVID, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest you have a look at that presentation because it was really insightful. At the moment, there's transient levels of anxiety for everyone. It doesn't necessarily mean there's long-term effects in terms of negative effects for all. It does have the potential to inspire and provide greater resilience, but there is going to be a group of people out there. The suggestions are around 4 million children that are going to need more targeted help and support, and young minds are calling for particularly targeted support. Potentially things like transition gently back into school and increased NHS support and community support around that. And of course, schools will have a part to play in getting children back to the new normal, whatever that may be. So if we now look at physical activity levels, well, they've decreased. Sport England data has been really helpful here. The good news is 93% of children are doing something to stay active. Now, 7% are not. They haven't done anything at all. But the amount of activity they've done has fallen, and it's continuing to fall even after things have eased, which I think is interesting, and I think Sport England is still sort of looking into why it's continuing to fall. So pre-COVID, the number of children who were meeting the 60 minutes a day worth of activity over the course of a week, which is the Chief Medical Officer's target, was just under half of children. That's fallen to 19% in the early July data that Sport England pulled out, and actually the Comres data from Sport England for the last few weeks is saying that's still falling to about 13% now. So there's something that's really happened. I think some of that is around the schools, and I'll share some of the reasons why that may be continuing to fall. And the inequality gaps around who's doing exercise and who isn't continue to be there. So we're seeing still that the less affluent, the BAME children and secondary age children are more likely to be doing no activity. And what's affecting this? Well, some of this I'm hoping you can bounce back from, because it is about access. So obviously lack of access to the organised facilities, so the gyms and the classes, and the more informal things like playgrounds and pitches. Schools had a part to play. So 36% of people are saying it's because there's just no school provision there. And I said that's the timetable stuff, but it's also lack of equipment and the associated opportunities. So the after schools clubs and the ability to use the facilities there. And for some children and parents, there's concerns about the virus and about going outside. And particularly BAME parents are twice as worried about letting their children outside to do exercise. Having said all of that, it's quite depressing stuff, but there are some opportunities and some interesting things coming through in the Sport England data. So girls more than boys and BAME children more than white are more likely to say they've increased activity during the lockdown, and they're more likely to say they're enjoying it more. Now, these are traditionally groups which tend to be less active. So I think there's something interesting here about what are they doing, or what are the new circumstances which mean that they are finding it easier or more enjoyable to do activity? Is it that it's non-competitive, it's a different type of activity? Is it there's less judgment around it? We know from the Youth Sport Trust Girls Active work that girls are often concerned about how they look or how much they're sweating, etc. And women in sport do similar kinds of research to back this up. But is there something there that we can learn about when we go back to normal, about potentially bringing in different types of activity which will encourage these children to continue? Other green shoots are that children are saying they're exercising for the benefit it brings, and less saying they're doing it for negative reasons. Obviously 69 plus 52 is more than 100%, so there's a bit of push and pull going on. I think the interesting thing here is many parents are saying that they have to do it, which is, I think, good from a parent's point of view. You know, they're obviously recognising the value of it. And research that Youth Sport Trust did with YouGov a few weeks ago has seen that children are valuing sport and activity. So over a third are now saying they see it as more important to their lives than they did before. 27% said it made them feel better during lockdown, and more than half plan to do more in the future than they did in the past. So I think they're all really positive, and I think it's about how we now grab those green shoots and think about how we can make changes, learning what we have done. Another interesting thing coming out of the Sport England data is about the role of parents as role models and as advocates for exercise. So what we've seen is the more active a parent is, the more active their children are likely to be. And I think, as we've also seen that children and parents have seen the benefits of exercise during lockdown, there's a role here, I think, for thinking about, once we get back to some form of normality, will children and families be able to carry on that, I suppose, to be able to exercise more together as a family, or be able to prioritise it and think about it in a different way. And I think the government saying that you have to do an hour, you can do up to an hour's worth of activity every day as one of the only things you could really do during lockdown has planted a seed in some people's heads that actually this is something I should be doing. It's like one of the basic sort of building blocks to life, and has started people thinking about how exercise could and should form more part of their lives. So if we look at what's helped during lockdown, I noticed a question raised a few weeks ago, so I looked into it. And there isn't a lot of data here, so quite a lot of this is qualitative, so I haven't got figures for any of this. I've got what is unhelpful to some people, but these are the kinds of things that are coming out. So people have generally, across a number of different studies that I've looked at, talk about communication with friends and family online as being really important, and that whole sort of continuation of as much normality as they can. Interaction via social media has been good for some, but certainly those with mental health conditions, they've found it actually unhelpful and have tried to avoid it if they can. Similarly, watching TV has been helpful for lots of people, but not necessarily the news, which has actually been detrimental for people, particularly if they're already struggling. Spending time with family and friends and pets, particularly the youngsters mentioning that. Exercise and activity we talked about, but playing games, doing some schoolwork, getting some element of structure to the day, and learning new skills. Home learning. So there's been, as I said, varying levels of provision and engagement and support here. We do know from the ONS that 65% of children have been learning at home, but on average, and it's very much an average, they've been spending about 2.5 hours a day on schoolwork. Which might come as a surprise. 20% have been doing less than an hour a day. I think provision, depending on age and on school and on circumstance, has been patchy. We've seen around 4 in 10 parents saying that children are just struggling to continue their education at home, be it through lack of guidance, motivation, support, and limited parental time. If you've got 2 parents working and trying to keep the children occupied, it's really hard. Now, for some, the difficulties have been around a lack of physical support. There's lots of different data here around exactly how many people haven't got a computer. It's about 7% haven't got access to a computer when they need it, or haven't certainly got access to their own computer or device. And that rises for those in receipt of free school meals. Similarly, a same sort of level of people haven't got a quality internet connection, which has enabled them to really link into schoolwork. There may also be a lack of resources at home. So we've seen some teachers actually delivering stationery and delivering things to homes to try and keep children, you know, with books and things like that. And we also see problems with overcrowding and a lack of dedicated space to be able to learn. And the impact of all of this can be far-reaching. I can't go through all the stats today, but there's some great data out there from EEF, from UCL, from Child Poverty Action Group, just loads of different things out there about what the impact of home learning and not learning at home could be. There's the headline there is a real headline that I've seen from earlier this week about how the educational gap could have implications for, you know, decades to come if not addressed. What we are seeing is the educational inequality gap seems to be widening. So girls and the more affluent and those from private school are much more likely to be doing more schoolwork than those that aren't from those backgrounds. Similarly, even within the state system, you're much more likely to be given active help if you're in the richest set of households than in the poorest set. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies are predicting a 15-day learning gap as a minimum between rich and poor by September. And the EF are talking about mitigation being essential, hence the National Tutoring Programme and evidence interventions. So if we look now about returning to school in September, so at Youth Sport Trust, we've done some surveys amongst children and amongst teachers to look at what the issues could be around returning to school. And we find that at the moment, 4 in 5 children say they are worried as they come out of lockdown. Now that's not sort of terror, you know, there's varying degrees of worry in there. But what we have asked children is, you know, what are they particularly worried about? And I do have a poll, which if you wouldn't mind launching that, Christine, about what do you feel the biggest concerns might be for children as they come out of lockdown and go back to school?
Okay, can you see that one? Has it come up? Excellent. So if you can all vote in there, that would be brilliant. As you know, I don't give you a lot of time. Oh, they're coming in. Great, cutting you off. Okay, so I'll just share those results with you. So you've got, so what is the biggest concern for children? Catching up on schoolwork, 27%. Whether they can spend time with friends, 27%. Passing the virus on to someone else, 18%. And missing home, 27%.
Interesting. So real split there. Hey, so let me show you.
I'm just going to stop sharing those. Is that all right?
Yeah, thank you. You ready for me to share?
Yep, go for it.
Big reveal. It's whether they spent on friends. It's almost the same as someone I know catching the virus. But yeah, I think it really shows that people are missing out on friendship. I mean, this is particularly true for younger children and for girls actually, but it is across the piece. Just are they going to be able to spend time with friends? Because, you know, with bubbles and everything at the moment, it's going to be quite difficult to even see their friends if they're going back to school. But yeah, getting back into a school routine is there. Catching up on schoolwork is there as well. But yeah, for them, it's about spending time with friends. Parents, yeah, there's been a reluctance to send children back to school. It's mainly about safety concerns at the moment, and we saw in June that there's highly variable levels of attendance. And the reluctance seems higher amongst the less affluent families, which has the potential to increase that learning gap. At the moment, I saw some research last week, which is saying up to a quarter at the moment are not intending to send children back in September, which is quite stark, but there's a few weeks left yet. It's because parents are worried. They need reassurance that the children are going to be safe, the schools are going to be safe, and that there's the right level of provision of emotional and mental support in there. So there's going to be an emphasis not just on work and catching up and this pressure to catch up straight away, but also an emphasis on playtime. And we know from other work that we've done that parents away from COVID still rate well-being as more important when choosing their school than academic achievement. And I think it's going to be particularly salient at the moment. So we've done research amongst teachers and school leaders, asking them what they felt would be the issues that they thought the children were more likely to display on their return. And this is my second poll here. Yeah, this is, what are you expecting children to display on return? What issues do you think you might have to deal with from the children? And if you won't mind launching that second poll, Christine.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Get that one. There we are. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Excellent. So if everybody can vote on that, that'd be brilliant. Same thing, time limited. they're getting good. Excellent. Brilliant. So I'm just going to shut it down there. Thank you for that, for being so fast.
Oh,
can you see that?
Yeah.
Excellent. So what is the biggest issue that school leaders are expecting children to have on their return? Anxiety, stroke fear, 30%, difficulty focusing on schoolwork, 20%, low physical fitness, no percent, so 0, and difficulty adjusting to routine again, 50%.
Pretty well done. Hey.
I'm going to stop those.
Okay. So, yeah. Half you're right. So yeah, difficult adjusting to routine again. 3/4 of people say that that's going to be the biggest challenge. They're also pulling out educational gaps. So I think probably surprisingly from that poll, the third thing that they're most worried about is low levels of physical fitness. And I think it's physical fitness in terms of fitness generally, but we've also seen with primary school some of the qualitative comments I've got coming in around sort of fine motor skills, you know, ability to hold pens and things like that. Just
yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, physicality really. But yeah, there's more information in the main report, but there's some big issues there that I think teachers are expecting to have to deal with. So, whoops, there you go. So returning to school, obviously from the Youth Sport Trust we're concerned particularly with sport and PE and activity and the role that has to play in building sort of improved mental and physical well-being. And it's good that the government is also encouraging schools to prioritise physical activity when they return because of these links. The school leaders that we spoke to say that they're going to have to change the focus of PE, which is good. I mean, not only increasing physical fitness, but also they believe that it's going to help with a greater focus on well-being and enjoyment. And they see it as a way to help children assimilate back into school and start to address some of the issues that we're seeing. The difficulty is going to be for PE in the short run is that less than half of schools are going to be able to offer PE in full immediately on return, just because of the current situation around logistics, so social distancing and equipment and things like that. Hopefully guidance is changing by the day and that might alter, but at the moment those kind of things really mean that it's quite difficult to deliver a PE lesson where you've got a lot of social mixing and things like that going on. And 3/4 say there's going to be less provision of after schools clubs and activities in the short run, which obviously impacts, you know, beyond the school day. So schools in particular are looking for clarity on a couple of things. So how to adapt the lessons within government guidelines, but then also how to use PE to address some of the wellbeing issues that they know it can be used to address. So what next? I'll finish on these couple of slides. I think in summary, there's obviously going to be needed to be some targeted support for children to support the mental health and in particular groups, so the BAME children, key worker families, girls, and those that have been most affected by everything that's happened. You'll have some children out there who will be bereaved, you know, who will know someone who's been severely impacted and who are going to need extra support to get through this. Physical health, you've got low levels of physical fitness, but I think there are opportunities there to start to engage people who may not have been engaged in the past. And as I said, we've got a huge bunch of people who have suddenly found physical activity to be something that they've enjoyed and that has helped them, and hopefully that will carry on. And there's a role for thinking about how we build social skills and confidence and resilience after something like this. I know Leah mentioned a couple of weeks ago, you know, we have the potential with the right tools in place to build resilience in children who've got through something which is difficult and they've come out the other side. There's going to need to be support for schools and education. So balancing, and it's a fine balance between catching up and improving children's wellbeing and closing those educational inequality gaps without just cramming children and switching people off entirely. But within the practical delivery issues that we have at the moment within our restricted world. And so I'll end by saying that I think there's been a lot of doom and gloom in this. So Leah's presentation a couple of weeks ago was a good reminder that it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. I think this is a good opportunity for us to think about, do we want to go back to normal? What could change as a result of this? Because there's been some really interesting things that have come out of it. So we've had to rely more on digital delivery, and it's meant that we've been more creative and more innovative in how we're doing things. And I think that creativity can carry on into learning more generally. I think the parental engagement piece in children, spending time with children in their education and in their overall well-being, I think is something that, you know, parents haven't had that opportunity to be with their children for a long time, and hopefully that will continue beyond lockdown. There's also been a greater appreciation for community, for volunteering, for caring about your neighbour, and about community connectiveness and the importance of community, which I think is something that needs nurturing and continuing. People have found that to be a real sort of comfort and something to focus on during the time. It could lead to a change in values. Some of the stats that I've seen recently show that children are much more likely to say that they want to be in education or they want to be in medicine as a result of this. You know, being a doctor has gone up hugely, and education as a safe career is something where they can see that they're making a real difference. So there's a greater appreciation of family time, and a greater role for children in decision making. They've been around for the last few months. They have been able to you know, choose what's on the telly, to choose when to go for a walk. You know, I think there might be much more of a feeling of family going forward. And I think the other thing to think about is about lack of academic pressure. So they are going to have to catch up, but everyone is going to have to catch up to some extent. I think thinking about how we can emphasise the all-round importance of social, mental and physical health and well-being, and as academic as part of that, rather than being the be-all and end-all of schools, I think is something that we could all take forward. And that's me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to ask Lisa. So I've got you there, Lisa, haven't I? You're still in. Brilliant. And I'll ask you to put your mic back on. So if you can stop sharing your screen, Amanda, and then we'll have us both in. But that's brilliant. Thank you. That was great. So this is your chance for questions. So send your questions in. I've got a couple to start us off, but I will try and get through as many as I possibly can. So the first question is, Amanda, what is an NGB?
Sorry, I've been in a youth sport just a year and I'm already using jargon. So.
The jargon just enters mind and won't leave us, doesn't it?
National governing body.
Say that again, sorry?
The national governing body, so a sporting body. So for instance, the cricket board or the FA, for instance. Am I right, Lisa?
Yes, you are, Amanda. That's spot on.
That's perfect. Thank you. It's always good to have those little jolts.
I was really conscious as well, Christine. There were some other ones that came out as well during the presentation. Amanda, you mentioned EEF as well, which is the Education Endowment Funds. Again, I didn't know whether that might have come up as another question, but we're all guilty of it in our various sectors.
Are we just? I know. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Also, UCL, that came in on the research, but is that
College London?
University College London. So, so the next question I have is, can you share your slides?
Yes.
That's great. That means people want to see them. So if you're able to share those, that's great.
Absolutely. And as I said, a lot of what I've talked about today, there's a lot more detail in the report. So how many pages is it? It's about 20 pages and counting. So there'll always be the latest version that I've managed to collate on the website.
This is a never-ending piece of work, isn't it? You're just going to be doing this for years.
Every time I get excited when new research comes in, but my heart sinks slightly because I'm thinking I'm going to have to change that. And it changes as well, because obviously the stats about how many parents are going to send children back to school, you know, I'm taking bits out and adding bits on. So I try to make it reflective of the zeitgeist of everything. It's quite difficult sometimes.
Well, keep us up to date because we'll add those onto the site. And the other question was around, so you talked about EEF, UCL. and the Child Poverty Action Group, and you were saying about their research. They had some great research. If you were able to share that with us, we can put that on our resources page. If you've got any links, that would be
absolutely.
brilliant.
So the document, it sounds like I'm plugging it, but the full document, which is on the website, has references, has about 60-70 references at the back, which are all linked through to the individual reports. So if people want to go on there, you can click onto it and it shoots you through to that individual report, so you can then get the full document that I've taken a sentence out of.
Lovely, thank you. And then there was a question here which was around, you talked about PE and the acknowledgement from young people of actually the impact on mental health, positive impact on mental health of physical activity. And so there's a question here around, you know, could we look at a collaboration between schools counsellors, pastoral care and PE teachers in a much more formalised fashion, so that we're actually making that link between mental health and physical activity within school environments?
Yeah, and I think Lisa might be able to take this one.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Absolutely, and certainly for us as an organisation, we are working really hard at the moment to look at that relationship between the subject of physical education and the delivery of wellbeing and the connectivity with, for example, PSHE in school, personal, social and emotional health and wellbeing. And I think there's a real opportunity. One of the things we're launching as a free movement is a wellbeing movement, where we want to look at that connectivity between the holistic provision of wellbeing in schools, and looking at schools considering that and the role of PE as a subject that can help drive that well-being across the whole school. So certainly, absolutely, for us as an organisation, it's the heart of our strategy, which Amanda shared at the start. Which for us, our whole 5-year strategy currently is about well-being, but it's making sure that as a subject of physical education, that's at the heart of schools as a means to support well-being of young people. So that collaboration is absolutely key, not just in an education context, but for me, it's about the collaboration between schools and the wider community as well. Mm-hmm. I know for me, what I'm really keen on advocating the work that we're doing is schools being seen as anchor institutions in their local communities. And I know I'm sure many of the audience that's on listening into this webinar now, if we are going to really make a difference in local communities, we have to look at that collaboration, cross-sector collaboration, and mirroring that in terms of cross-departmental collaboration in schools is absolutely going to be key if we're then going to look at schools and the roles they can play in supporting communities as well. So definitely something that's at the heart of the work that we're doing, and I think has to be key for the way forward, particularly when we look at the amount of services that are going to be impacted on economically by the pandemic too.
Thank you. Another thing that's come up that's connected actually is about families exercising together, because obviously parents have been at home and there's been much more of that going on. And actually, what are you doing, Youth Sport Trust, but also what would you be sort of encouraging within communities about getting families to continue exercising together as something that just becomes an inherent part of our daily lives?
Yeah, so traditionally we as an organisation have been very much focused on our work with families through schools, school engagement. We are just recently, and last month, we had our National School Sport Week. National School Sport Week for us is a moment in time annually, which has run for the last 12 years, that we've very much focused on celebrating all that's good about PE, school sport and physical activity, and encouraging participation through that. This year, because of COVID, we were forced into the situation of looking at National School Sport Week at home and really putting the emphasis on that social connectedness that sport brings to young people and brings to families, but really reinforcing how we could do that through family engagement. Hugely successful, and as a result of that, now we're looking at how we continue to provide that free to access support for parents in relation to how families, parents and carers, I would stress in that context as well, how we can look to support them to continue to think about how they can engage in activity. So in 2 weeks' time, we're about to launch our second newsletter for parents, which is about helping them through the summer holidays as well. So that's Stay Active Staycation, we're calling it. So and we're going to look again, providing some support and simple tips and techniques around how they can continue to stay active with their young people, with their families and young people, but also start to think about how we build on that and continue to provide that support. But I do recognise that, you know, it's a bit about that. The challenge is far greater in some of those communities where they don't have access to open spaces in the same way. They don't have access to some of the resources that will enable them to access the services available as well. So it's keeping it really simple, not keeping it really accessible, and all of the guidance that we've provided and continue to provide through COVID, and that's what we intend to build on as well. And we've done that on our website, but recognising again that people need some tangibles as well.
Thank you, that's brilliant. And I'm assuming that the newsletter is accessible via your website to people?
Absolutely, yes. And what we intend to do there is anybody can access it once it's launched. But what we might do, Christine, is to send it out to you to share with audiences as well, if that's helpful.
Excellent. Yes, no, we'd love that. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions here. So from Roxy, she says, children and young people are obviously being hugely impacted from COVID. What practical things can we do to help them? So I know we've covered some, but this is your opportunity to add any more in that you think might be useful.
Go on, you start, Lisa.
Obviously, what we're about as an organisation is looking at how we can utilise physical activity and sport as a mechanism to support young people in a whole host of ways. So very much it's using sport and physical activity as the catalyst for wider learning and wider access. So, you know, we've got some targeted support there around helping young people see the benefits of the physical activity above and beyond participating in physical activity and getting physically fit, if that makes sense. So, you know, it's all about the friendships, helping bring young people together through that. It's about we've got some simple resources and support for understanding how being physically active and looking at different types of physical activity. For example, a big one over COVID has been mindfulness and the whole, you know, being appreciative of the outdoors and walking and, you know, the outdoor environment activities are all things that will not only help with getting people active, but will help with mental health, will help with friendships, will help with learning. There's a massive correlation between young people that are physically active and their ability to learn. So if we can help young people understand that their ability to get back into schooling will be enhanced if they're physically active, that's the kind of thing where it's just helping their knowledge and understanding of what the purpose of being physically active is about.
Thank you. So we've also got here, so in your research, have you come across any evidence which tells us about whether young people are or are not connecting more with people from different backgrounds during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Certainly qualitatively, people have pulled out where they've been able to help and volunteer, and certainly things like the Clap for Carers gets mentioned, volunteering to help, you know, in their local community. That's come out qualitatively. I haven't seen a lot of quantitative data. I don't know if that exists. It's quite difficult to hear from young people, and I think that's been one of the challenges on this data. You know, we hear a lot from the parents, but hearing directly from children, not so much. I was talking to Simon Roth yesterday, who's been looking at work in this, and he feels that that intergenerational thing is really important, and sport's got the potential to be able to help sort of bridge that gap. And I think, you know, during lockdown, we see a lot more children, you know, exercising with their parents, exercising, you know, with older siblings in a way that they haven't done before. So certainly that interaction's been there, I think, in a way that wouldn't have occurred to them. I mean, I think some of it originally was being forced to, but you know, you'd hope that that would continue. So we see some of the activities that they are doing and they've been able to do about walking and biking, they tend to do those with their family, with people from different generations. And I think obviously social distancing has put paid to, you know, mixing too much, but where they can, certainly within families, they've really grabbed that opportunity.
There's another question here which is about food poverty. And so obviously there's an impact between sort of sport, ability to take part in sport and physical activity connected to food poverty, and whether you've got any research sort of connected to what we're looking at. How big or how bad does that look?
I haven't seen anything directly on that. I know that there are a few things out there, but I mean, I can have a look and see if there's anything directly on that. But no, I haven't come across it. I don't know if you have, Lisa.
I haven't come across any specific research, but again, just sharing, we're working with 2 of the DFE funded, holiday hunger funded programs across the country this summer. As a result of COVID, those authorities were looking at innovative ways we could support their holiday hunger program with resources to go into vulnerable families and parents across the country. So we're working with Southwark and also with Suffolk, and we have about 8,000 families who are receiving direct packages of support in relation to the physical activity components, alongside vouchers for holiday hunger, whereas they would normally have been accessing holiday hunger programs in the community. Because those have been restricted, they've looked at alternative mechanisms. So it'd be really good to look at the impact of that and how those, but we don't have that information at this stage. But again, it's just a demonstration of the different response to addressing that balance between holiday hunger and activity over the summer holidays, and young people's access to programs because of the restrictions of COVID as well.
Perhaps, I know that there's obviously a limited resources out there, but perhaps any kind of community activity that takes place going forward, if there's food involved in that for families, you know, that's got to be a win-win, hasn't it? Because
absolutely,
it also means people don't have that embarrassment of having to ask for food or to admit that they may be struggling, particularly for families where the struggle may be new.
You know, the governments strive on obesity now, which will be a big push, and we've already started to see the mechanism. Obviously, a big focus of that will be on what is the energy in piece, the food and the labelling and but that balance between food intake and physical activity, and the more we can do to connect the messaging and connect the energy in and the energy out balance is really important. But that isn't underestimating the challenges that are faced by families that are in food poverty. You know, so that whole healthy eating agenda is going to be even more challenging for them, but it isn't, you know, it needs to be addressed, and we need to look at supporting that in a way that enables families to access provision.
Thank you. So I've got a question here from Joe. When you mentioned about young people being anxious about going back to see friends, you seem to speak more about their anxiety as to whether they would be able to see their friends or not, whereas I related to it in a sense of a fear of socializing again, as I know that many adults also have that fear. Could you expand on this at all and what you've discovered?
I think there's a mix of both of those things in there. So yeah, we know for some children that there will be that anxiety about just sort of emerging, and I've seen, yes, the adult research as well about emerging from lockdown and the social anxiety that's around that. I think there is, though, that am I actually going to be able to do it? And I think, you know, you saw that concerns about the virus are there. concerns about catching the virus are there. But I think for some children, it's just that they've missed that social interaction, and they just want to make sure that they are able to meet their friends and to be able to do that at school, because that's one of the main reasons why they want to get back to school. They want to be with their friends, they want to socialise, they want to play with them again. And it's, are they going to be allowed to do that? Are they going to be able to access that? So I can't put numbers on it. I think there's a mix of both within there. But yeah, there is an element of it's going to take a while of hand holding, I think, for everyone. What's the new normal feel like? I know when I go shopping, it feels odd. You forget how close you can stand. You've got masks and things like that on. I think it's going to take people a process of readjustment, and that's why I talk about how I think we need to be sort of gentle and transitional in how children go back to school. This ability to get back to a routine, which teachers are pulling out, is really important. What is a routine? I think it's going to take a few weeks to just settle into what's normal and what's acceptable again.
Thank you. You mentioned about when we looked at the sort of concerns that parents had about sending their children back to school, and you were talking about actually their concern is about well-being, which it seems to be anyway, regardless of COVID, that the school that they go to is related to where they feel their child would be happiest, which makes sense, doesn't it? But looking at sort of the current crisis that we're in at the moment and children going back to school, how much of an emphasis on mental health and well-being do you think publicly there needs to be around schools and curriculums to make parents feel more comfortable about sending their children back, particularly in their, because I think when you showed the data, you were looking at children from where there's more poverty are less likely to send their children back to school, more likely to be worried. Sorry, that's a very long question.
Yeah, I think that the physical safety is probably top of mind because it's the more easily articulated, I suppose, and the more obvious one. So I think the data is showing that people are particularly concerned about, are their children going to be physically safe? I think once they've got that reassurance that they're going to be physically safe, then the next level is, and what's it going to be like for my child to assimilate back into school? Because there'll be some children who, say, got social anxiety, who don't want to go back to school necessarily. We see that younger children in particular are concerned about homesickness and about not wanting to leave their family. So I think once you get past that, is it actually physically safe and therefore almost physically possible in people's heads that the children can go back? It's then what's that environment going to be like once they go back? And then I think we start talking about the well-being and how lessons are delivered, because I think that there is a concern out there that they're just going to get crammed, that and particular year groups as well, are just going to get absolutely crammed. So the pre-GCSE year is now going to have so much pressure put on them to try and catch up. I think there's a concern there, and I think from what I see, the government are already thinking about what do exams look like next year. So I think there's some thinking behind, can they catch up? Should they catch up, or should they get to a level where it's reasonable that they can do this amount of work within this amount of time to achieve a grade at the end?
There was a suggestion about cutting the level of PHSE. So I know that school staff actually would like a whole term of PHSE. All the people that I've spoken to have said, this is what we need. We need a half a term or a whole term of literally just PE and PHSE so that we can manage this. But actually the opposite appears to be happening, which is a cut in PHSE. Have you discovered any more about that? Probably more than I know.
It's interesting. The work we did with school leaders said some people were under pressure to deliver maths and English and make sure that they were being delivered successfully. I think it was refreshing that the majority was saying that they saw a role for PE, and I think all the work we do shows that people who do prioritise a rounded curriculum which includes PHSE, includes a role of activity, that those people tend to be more successful in all elements of their life. We do separate research where we look at linking attainment through to PE and looking at general well-being, and there's obviously links there. So I think it's short-sighted to just say, let's focus on maths and English and cut out PE, because I think, you do that and you may actually fail.
PE and PHSE, all the ones with just letters,
Yeah.
is what we need a bit more of, perhaps. So just if anybody has got a final question, now is your time to send it through. Just checking there are no more that have come in, and make sure I've covered everyone that I said that I would. Let's just have a little look. So related to the areas of poverty, particularly areas of poverty and deprivation, and perhaps less of an engagement in academia anyway, in those particular areas because of various other issues, are there things that we could and should be doing in those areas specifically, or pushing for in those areas specifically, to help those children not catch up academically necessarily straight away, but actually manage what seems to be a higher level of potential trauma, especially those children that have been children of care workers, key workers within this time, and the BAME background children as well. What should we be doing to kind of level that playing field a bit?
I think it's really interesting. It's a really good question, and I think the social divides and the what's emulated as a result of COVID, I think will lead to a more targeted approach to the provision going forward. So I know Sport England currently are in consultation over their new strategy, and certainly what they are already talking about in the context of sport for development is the need for us to put more targeted work and targeted approach into those areas of greatest need. So with the disproportionate impact of COVID on those areas of deprivation, Christine, I think we have to have a disproportionate level of investment and offer into those areas going forward. So we have a more targeted approach to the provision of any programs and funding opportunities. And I think we're already starting to see that. But I think it'll be more going into those areas of greatest needs to try and level the playing field, or excuse the pun, but to narrow the gap. So certainly for us as an organisation and as a children's charity, we absolutely want to be driving focused work in those areas of greatest need. Clearly a universal offer where we can, and universal offer of support, but certainly then with targeted support in those areas of greatest need, because that's the only way we're going to ensure that the resources are put into those communities. And we are going to enable, and what we also need to be looking at is that real collaborative, almost like coordinated approach. So it's a systemic change across the board in those areas, rather than piecemeal targeted approaches. It really needs to be a coordinated approach in those areas.
Thank you. I've got another question related to that collaboration. Could we have, so I remember years ago there were creative partnerships in schools where you brought various sort of creatives into a school, so all sorts of things, meditation, and how things could be embedded into the curriculum, how you could do it in a maths class or a science class. Is there a call now perhaps for PHSE and PE to be done kind of within curriculum? So we're doing maths, science, etc., but we're actually going out, we're doing something physically active at the same time. Could there be a better way of looking at it rather than us having all these separate lessons? Is that maybe a way forward?
Yeah. That strategy of active learning and active pedagogy is absolutely something that is being delivered, but it's not necessarily being delivered across the board. But those schools that absolutely see the connection between activity and cognitive learning are looking at that active pedagogy as a mechanism for doing that. I think there's a lot to be said about coordinating that more and considering that more, and learning. Yeah, there's lots of, I've been with the charity 22 years. So, you know, it's interesting when you say, Christine, that things that you've done in the past. So one of the things we led as a strategy for government when there was specialist schools was how you use specialism, and the specialism of sport or the specialism of technology or...
Oh, sorry, you've frozen a bit, Lisa. Specialism of sport and specialism of technology, and how you use those in different ways. I'm thinking that you might be saying. I'm really sorry, we've just lost you, and I'm probably going to have to wrap us up. So I'm just going to close, but thank you so much for that. Thank you, Amanda and Lisa, for sharing your time and your research investigations with us that are ongoing, never to end, Amanda, I suspect. And thank you to all of you for sending in your questions, which were brilliant. We'll now be taking a break over August, and we'll come back with our 5th webinar in the Living Room series in September. So keep an eye on our website for news. And if you've missed any of this series or previous ones, you can also catch up on our website. So belongnetwork.co.uk. So have a fantastic summer, and I'll see you on the other side. Goodbye, and thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks so much.